Well, I just wanted to make sure that I reinforced a reality which I'm sure you were aware of looking at the agenda. But one of the key important aspects of NTL's past and its present, and we hope its future, is the participation, the involvement, the energy, the support of our members who are global and based internationally. And if you had a chance to look over the agenda, you'll see that we have the benefit of an extraordinary number of folks whose work takes them outside the boundaries of our little insular world here in the United States. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of those global members who many of you, I'm sure, have been appreciating, I hope, directly, but perhaps from afar, and now have a chance to meet her, and that's Kate Cowie, who comes to us from the United Kingdom. And here's Kate.
Well, good day, everyone. It is my responsibility to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Jean Neumann. Jean is a member of NTL and a senior fellow in scholarly practice at the Tavistock Institute in London. A scholar practitioner par excellence, she operates a private consultancy practice, teaches on courses for consultants and change agents, and conducts action research that integrates theory and practice for workable approaches for real-life change. Her early professional development in the US was based on a progressive orientation, mostly shaped by NTL. And in 1987, she relocated to the UK, where at Tavistock, she learned to appreciate how regressive social and political aspects of human behavior underpin consultancy and change practice. Jean has more than 30 publications to her name, based on action research that emphasize integrating systems psychodynamics, organizational theory, and change practice. She's also been engaged in more than 450 successful change projects in which she's been able to apply what she believes to be a necessary, if idiosyncratic, blend of shadow consultancy, intervention design, role analysis, clinical supervision, business development, and practice improvement. When Kathy asked me to host this session for Jean, I was delighted to do so. NTL is for me a place of learning, colleagueship, and friendship, which Jean exemplifies. In an article she wrote for Practicing Social Change, she teaches us that in any social system, in all social systems, multiple social differences are apparent and multiple stratification schema are at play. We need to broaden the range of social differences we attend to as scholarly practitioners, she says. Wise counsel for us in NTL as we seek to reinvent ourselves for the next 75 years, if we are to have global relevance, global reach. In recent years, I've also been privileged to staff NTL programs with Jean. I will say that, whatever happens, I always know that when Jean is dean, all will be well in the end. And finally, life is bumpy. Life can be hard for all of us, outside and inside NTL. I have valued Jean's friendship in good times and bad. She really does embody for me all that I appreciate about being a member of NTL. So as we say in the UK, conference, with great pleasure, I give you Dr. Jean Neumann.
Thank you, Kate. Is somebody going to let me do screen share, please? I hope I'm going to be allowed to do screen share. Otherwise, life is going to be difficult.
You should be able to, Dr. Jane.
Okay, well, so far it's telling me that the host has disabled participant screen share.
Try it again.
Aha. Now I have to find, there it is. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about myself and just a hint. And then mostly I'm going to focus on a topic that stays very fresh and exciting for me, which is the ways in which some Lewin principles that aren't so broadly known are helpful for integrating NTL and the Tavistock Institute. Are we okay with the way it looks? You can see me and you can see the PowerPoint, can you? Good. I always hate it when you can't see the speaker. They only do the PowerPoint. Okay, well, I began I should tell you, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, maybe less. There may be time for questions of clarification, and then we're going to go into breakout rooms for 15 minutes or so. And then we'll come back for question and answer and discussion. So I began my career as an organizational development consultant in Providence, Rhode Island. I was 20 years old. Initially, I worked with small alternative organizations, not-for-profits, charities, and higher education institutions. And all of my development at that point was with NTL-related trainers. Two people who stand out were Khalil Jameson and Dave Brown. Many of you will know these people. I ended up doing an organizational behavior doctorate in why people don't participate when they're given the chance, given that participation is still is an essential aspect of our field. And that was at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. It was a while back. I was influenced by Bill Passmore, Dave Kolb, and Eric Nielsen. Again, people some of you will know. While I was there, I was exposed to the schools of thought associated with the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. I'd had one very frustrating sort of group relations weekend. I didn't really understand it. I knew it was important, but I didn't understand it. I also met Eric Miller when he came through to do a conversation as a part of a conference that Suresh Srivastava had sponsored. And meeting Eric Miller was pretty important because he was an elder at the Institute and also a critical actor in both socio-technical systems and group relations, which was a combination I hadn't quite understood at the time. As Kate has said, in 1987, I immigrated to London in the UK to take up a consulting social science role at the Tavistock Institute, specifically to rejuvenate the action research in industry and commerce. And I think it's useful to know that probably I received that job because of my extensive NTL training at that point. I found the work that I took up there as incredibly difficult and challenging. I was working with larger systems than I was used to, and I had to deal with cultural differences that were very specific, both nationally and regionally, within the UK, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, France, Germany. I mean, I was just a girl from Hilliard, Ohio, really, is how I felt. I was also being supervised by Eric Miller, who was an anthropologist, while simultaneously being supervised by Liesl Klein, who was an industrial sociologist, which was a strange mixture. Neither of them had had positive experiences with NTL or organizational development. And in fact, Liesl Klein had written a book, quite interesting book, called Social Science in Industry. And she was furious with American OD consultants who came over and ruined years of careful work in one of her client systems. Now, a decade into that work, now my screen's showing all kinds of things in front of the headlines. Can you still see the headlines? Thank you, Peter. A decade into my initial work at the Tavistock Institute, I wrote a paper for the OD practitioner on what I had learned about how to do OD in the United Kingdom. And the reference for that is at the bottom of your screen, as well as in the resources that the organizers of the conference are making available. In reflecting on my experience, I identified 4 hard-won lessons, places where I had gotten caught as an OD consultant and had to work particularly hard to help the client system succeed in their changes. So, and I just am showing you these. The binoculars symbolizes avoiding being narrowly focused. And my lesson here was that to be sure to diagnose and dialogue at both micro and macro levels of the social system to which I was consulting. We used to talk about micro OD and macro OD all the time, and there are books still with those titles on my shelf. The image of the stags fighting with their antlers is meant to symbolize the inevitability of conflict and political dynamics in any substantial change. And it's probably not a surprise that as I began to work with larger systems, there was more politics and more conflict. My lesson here was to avoid, inappropriate neutrality in a situation where to do so would undermine the outcomes of high integrity participative processes. If I say to you, usually we didn't mix OD and trade union decision-making processes. That was sort of the pattern at the time, even in the UK. The image of the mountain looking over the wider view symbolizes the danger of only working at the top of any hierarchy. And my lesson here was to learn the importance of going down into the broader organization in order to connect changes being instructed from above with the complex wider organizational realities. And this maze over here is the fourth hard-won lesson. And it symbolizes how easy it can be to locate interventions in a way that is off track of essential cross-boundary learning, stuck in little rooms, regional offices, out of the geography of key stakeholders, key actors. And my lesson, don't do that. My lesson here was to always presume the interrelated levels of hierarchy, for example, in supply chains and other connections cross-boundary in any organizational development work. So these were lessons that came from me using that good NTL, reflect on experience in order to learn. And eventually I was able to notice that these lessons that were hard won for me seem to exemplify what I would call the Tavistock Institute house style. Not everybody, by the way, agrees with me that that's the case at the Tavistock Institute. And I think that this house style is actually deeply rooted in Lewinian principles. I'm sorry I didn't give you, I did an article on Kurt Lewin stopping at the Tavistock Institute, just called Kurt Lewin at the Tavistock Institute. Sorry, I don't have the reference with me. Lewin was extremely influential in the early days of the Tavistock Institute. He and Eric Trist corresponded quite dramatically, and there were other connections. But not the younger generation don't always grab onto this. Lewin, they don't, at the Tavistock Institute, they don't necessarily see Lewin in the same light that NTL does. Now, in the late 1990s, I came across an article by Martin Gold, which some of you may know, in the Journal of the Psychological Study of Social Sciences. More commonly, it's known as the Journal of Social Issues. In this article, Gold offers an analysis of a handful of Lewinian principles that he thinks that he had discerned from Lewin's writings. I like that article a lot. I was very influenced by it. But from it, in thinking about this house style business, I identified 4 of these principles or rules, as Gold called them, that I think relate specifically to integrating NTL and the Tavistock orientations for organizational development and change. So I'm not talking primarily about group work, although group work is essential to everything we do, of course, but I'm primarily thinking about the organizational development and change angle on things. Now, I'm going to talk about each of these four that I've selected because I think they are this integration between Tavistock and NTL. I'm going to give you a short definition from Lewin, a practice pointer and a diagnostic tip from my own experimentation with these rules, and then two summaries of two cases in which these rules I think really dominate. Now you see down here, and I'll repeat this if you don't write it down now at the bottom. Sorry, you can't see me pointing to the bottom of the screen. There is a website. That's the Tavistock Institute website. And you'll see it goes all the way over to lectures and presentations. If you click on that, that will take you to the section of the Tavistock website that has these rules. There are 4 different papers. And the last time I looked, as of the 12th of July, you had to click on pages 8 and 9 to see the 2 on each page. And that'll show up again at the end and also in the resources somewhere. So here we go. First one. Oh, yes. The little red flag is to remind me to say to you that these principles are interconnected, and you'll notice the interconnections as we go. They're not like they're purely, totally separate from each other. Okay. So the dynamic approach rule, this is really about motivations. And Lewin says that the elements of any situation should be required as part of a system. Right. And by that, the practice pointer I've come to with that is to describe or indeed draw broad pictures of groups, intergroups, organizational and interorganizational relationships that relate to the issue under consideration. And I'm always surprised at how many organizational development consultants manage to work without organizational charts. I don't know how they do that. It is possible to draw your own, and these days I know there's lots of experimentation with how to show it, this and that. But the real point is the Lewinian point. Are we considering how the elements of the situation we're being asked to help the client with connects to the broader systems? And the diagnostic tip is about motivation. What is motivating this person, these people, this group to behave the way they are? Where's the energy for the change coming from? And here are a couple of examples. So one of my earliest, when I first arrived, there was a European decision that had been taken that all organizations above a certain size, all businesses of a certain size, had to have representatives of workers on their board of directors. And the workers in the workers' council, sometimes they were called workers' representatives, each of the countries involved had to vote in favor of this or not. And the UK labor movement voted against participating. And this was considered so shocking for the European Commission and the UK government that they commissioned Tavistock Institute to try and answer the question, why? Well, it was by, in fact, regarding all the elements of the situation as a part of the system that influenced the UK trade unions, that Gordon Lawrence and Eric Miller were able to come up with this, looking across societal forces, the history of workplace democracy, industrial democracy, as it's called in Europe, and the individual psychological forces inside the trade union representatives. Now, they came up with this idea of failed dependency. Another way of saying that is the trade union didn't trust the leaders, the managers, the executives. Why would they want to be? They don't want to be put onto a board having to cooperate with them and thereby losing their power of protest and strike, etc., in order to get what they need to honor the power dynamics in the situation. So that was a quite interesting version of that. It's quite a tinier case, small organization. My colleague Jacqueline McLemore, some of you may know Jackie, and we were doing a OD project with an organization that served victims of both sexual assault and domestic violence. And to my total surprise, there was a split in the organization between those who worked in sexual assault and those who worked in domestic violence. a lot of conflicts for resources and development between the hotline and the shelter. And it was only by taking all the elements of the situation and regarding the organization as a system and its environment, including its funding environment as a system and the communities in which they worked, were we able to help them improve the situation. And this was done by mobilizing jointly shared volunteers, interventions at the board, work at subunit level and small group level. So those are two examples of the dynamic approach rule. Elements of any situation should be regarded as parts of a system. Now we're going to move on to the field theory rule. Now this, Lewin says, analysis starts with the situation as a whole. Boy, if you don't take anything away today, this analysis starts with the situation as a whole. And I think, from my point of view, practically, what he's talking about is multiple causal conditions and the interaction that affects multiple causal conditions. And it's basically, if you're thinking about the whole, then you're going to be looking at things like, well, diagnostically, from whom does this problem come, and where do they get it, and what happens to it? What do they do with it, and who do they give it to? And are we looking upwards or downwards or sideways? Or what is the whole situation? In a little place like the United Kingdom, there's always an answer that includes funding from the government, or in the European context, European legislation is now. So that's pretty big. That's a pretty big situation to keep in mind as an organizational development consultant. Here's an example of a project, one of my first big projects at the Institute. It had been going on for years, but they had never, about casualties to commercial ships. Casualties in this case does not mean human beings. It means things like oil spills, grounding in ports, ships hitting each other. And that's almost the entire organizational field involves captains blaming commerce, blaming the captains, and everybody blaming the weather. And then pretty soon we start blaming other shipping companies from other worlds. It's a global, if you know anything about commercial shipping, it's a huge international business. And the only way that we were really able to get a handle on this very complicated situation was we used Miles and Huberman's causal maps. And that's some of you may know, it's kind of a square book. And I think it's called qualitative data analysis these days. It used to be a white hardback. I think it's probably different now. And there's the causal mapping process I found so useful. You take the various variables you found in your diagnostic and dialogue process with people. And from that, we were able to discover directions for interventions that were like proposals at 5 different levels: individual roles, interdepartmental, interorganizational, and a legal regulation. It was much bigger than this next story. So this is a totally not technical, but there's an element of business, and this has to do with points of innovation and customization at the interface between health and social care for the elderly. And the government had mandated innovation with small providers. Now, small providers would be like mom and pop care homes, and this was in a county that had coastline. Of 3/4 of it was coastline, and all along that coastline were these small mom and pop care homes for the elderly. Now, the goal of the government was to save money and to try and get innovations in this service out of small providers. It was really complicated, levels of participation at the regional level, the government level, regulators and the owners of medium-sized firms, and then a couple small providers, because the small providers owners couldn't disappear very long to go to meetings. And it was only toward the end that we listened to a story where the owner of one of these small providers described what happens for her whenever she needs to get extra money for a particular out of the NHS. for caring for the elderly or for the social care budget, also from the region, which here they're called councils. So there's the owner and the manager of the care home. There's representatives, care managers for each client has a care manager, and they have hundreds of carers, people they're looking after. And then there are the regulators, most of whom have some reports somewhere into the government structure, and then the funders. So this particular woman was complaining, the owner was complaining how she had lost some certification because she needed to ask for extra help for this guy. And then she described two or three very difficult meetings that she had had with this group of about 4 people. And it was clear that what she was describing was how through the conflict, they ended up with an innovation that not only just worked for that person, but then required the other people to go back and make changes and negotiate changes. Now, to me, that's a beautiful example of an analysis that's starting with the whole, and we ended up with multiple causal conditions. Yeah. So that's field theory. And now we're moving on, 2 more to go. Contemporaneity rule. Now, this is Lewin's word, contemporaneity. The closest we have is contemporaneous, which means existing or occurring at the same time. And Lewin says I'm sure you've heard this, only conditions in the present can explain experience and behavior in the present. And we would say from an OD point of view, only interventions in the present can bring about behavioral change in the present. So the practice pointer here is to identify what within the present situation contributes to behaviors and attitudes held by, it says clients, that's a Freudian slip, held by the people who have to make the change. And the diagnostic tip is that people will talk about the history, but the clue then is to get them to say, how does that show itself now and in what ways? So we're looking for if the history is still niggling away, what's going on in the present that it's still here. For some reason, I'm thinking about the statues, the current that were knocked over recently in the last year or two, the continued presence of celebration of slave owners and other such people. So I thought you might like to see this old 1960s project on race relations in the civil service. This was funded by, again, the government asked the Tavistock Institute, what are we going to do here? These people, highly visible stakeholders, bad-mouthing each other on the radio, on the television, in big meetings, lots of emotions, back and forth, people who've been hurt in the past, talking a lot about that, people who benefited in the past, not wanting to consider, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, Murray and Gregory in this work got to a point where the most that they could really encourage the complicated set of committees and meetings involved was to focus explicitly on the contemporary concrete elements of fairness in personnel procedures and selection. Now, that doesn't sound very juicy to us nowadays, but in the 60s, it was pretty juicy. I think that's fair to say. Do you agree, Kate? Would you say, yeah? Okay. So, and here's another very different example, a similar kind of issue. So this was a problem where there was no apparent heir within an Anglican monastery. I was in the UK at the time, and I was asked to come to the US to work with this. Now, Anglican means, Episcopalian or Church of England, all male monastery, to come over and work with them because they didn't want anybody to know who they were. They wanted only people who weren't actually going to be a part of their existing network. Now, this was a very highly respected, well-known monastery, and therefore the people who got to be at the top tended to be the elite, the cream of the crop of the monastery crop. We weren't supposed to think that way. And what didn't take us very long in the organizational development process to discover that there were several worthy and capable younger brothers who could be prepared to be moved into these kind of leadership roles, eventually landing on the Father Superior position, which is the heir, top heir. But the problem was is that people were underdeployed. It's a lot of work to run a monastery, and people were underdeployed in the more visible, juicy jobs, you might say. And we eventually came up with several iterations of what we actually called tests in the present, because people were very involved in the history. Now, if you know anything about monasteries, you will know that the Benedictine rule is a very powerful force in monasteries. And people are very preoccupied with that historical document about how monasteries need to be run. And it's a bit autocratic. So we put in quite a bit of sort of modern day innovation through these tests in the present to discover and evolve shared leadership styles, structures, and processes appropriate to the contemporary situation. So that was all based on the contemporaneity rule. Changes in the present were required, even though people were very preoccupied with the past. And now I think we're coming up to the last one, the constructive method rule. And here Lewin is saying, create concepts, however intangible, that seem necessary for explanation. So intangible means it's hard to grasp, difficult to pin down. People might not like the language, it's too distant from how they normally talk. The aim of the conceptualization is to be useful. So it's useful so that people can find other ways to talk about the problem or the challenge facing the client system. Now, this is the diagnostic bit is really, really challenging, and it's so theoretically and practically interesting. You're asking, how are the environment and the people in this situation inseparably bound together? That's Lewin's language. That's the quote. That's a Lewin quote. How are the environment and the people in this situation inseparably bound together? So that's what you're wanting to intervene in. And what I think is really interesting is he recognized that putting a word on that or words on that was going to feel a bit odd for people to take in. I'll give you two different examples. So there's wonderful work that went on for about 6 years in the UK on competing agencies in town planning. If you know anything about building projects, say a new school is being built, well, then there's probably changes that have to be made to the roads. You're putting in a new leisure center. Well, that's probably going to knock out a whole set of apartment blocks, and all those people who live there are going to have to be relocated. So, and any building projects, anything from 35 agencies, that is contractors, as much as to 2, 3, 4, 500, lots and lots and lots of people involved in building. So multi-party collaboration for complex planning is a given. The trouble is what are the concepts? The concepts that really have made a huge difference within the building trade in the UK come from this project. Management of uncertainty in planning. Now, the management of uncertainty idea, wonderful book, Management of Uncertainty. Maris is the guy's name, M-A-R-I-S. And there the whole point is that uncertainty is competitive. People who are going to suffer most tend to be lower status, less central to what's going on. The idea is to put all that uncertainty into them, and the people who have power don't suffer as much. And the whole point here is reciprocal management of uncertainty, so that people share the uncertainty, organizations and the various stakeholder groups share. That really makes a huge difference. And the other concept that's been amazing and helpful is the idea of the analysis of interconnected decision areas. Now, Friend and Hickley, you can find, there are 2 or 3 books that they did. You probably have to go to libraries to order them. Analysis of interconnected decision making. So that's got to be thought through, and the order's got to be thought through, and then the sharing of the uncertainty related to it. Now, a much less technologically oriented is a reasonably recent project I thought you'd be interested in. That is the community role in preventing violent extremism. And this is paid UK government, has to do with Muslims being groomed, Muslim children, teenagers, young adults being groomed to go and find themselves off someplace else, being violent, being prepared to be violent. Now, the stakeholders in this kind of project include multiple types of religions, because of course, not all Muslims, lo and behold, just like all Christians aren't the same, all Jews aren't the same, all Muslims aren't the same. Religious organizations, police, schools, social workers. So that's a short list of stakeholders. And the big conflict problem, why there's a little explosion there, is the mismatch in expectations of those groups and multiple voices, all the controversy about how to work. And strangely enough, the conceptualization that the researchers, Iacopini and Stock, came up with is that it's legitimate to deliver on the objectives of preventing violent extremism, even if people don't agree with the underlying assumptions and rationales. So if the police can do certain things and the different religious representatives do different things depending on their particular orientation, the police, schools, social workers, they all do different things, that if they can deliver on the objectives of preventing violent extremism, that's legitimate, even if they don't agree with each other around the assumptions or the rationale. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so there you are, 4 examples of these 4 Lewinian rules that I think really work very well between NTL, organizational development, applied behavioral science, and the Tavistock Institute's more applied social science, a bit more slightly different angles. Any element of a situation should be regarded as a part of a system. Analysis starts with the situation as a whole. Only conditions in the present can explain experience in the present and create concepts, however intangible, that seem necessary and useful for explanation. And I think that's less than 30 minutes. Who's ever helping me keep track of time? Thank you. And again, I've given you the reference down at the bottom, so you don't have to, if you write it out now, you won't have to look it up on the resources. And literally, if you click on that, you'll have 2 pages on each of those 4, and there's references in there as well. And each of the 4 have the references. So I think, do we have time for, what time? How are we doing on time?
Well, Jean, we do have a question. We do have one question.
Yeah, questions, just clarification. Do we have?
Yeah, one question for clarification. So could you please clarify or expand on the hard lesson of avoiding confusing neutrality with complicit undermining politics as social facts?
I can give an example. Okay. So this was a U.S. corporation was building a German company was building for the U.S. corporation a factory next to an old factory. Can't tell you which company it is. And the old factory had been there for 25, 30 years. And the new factory was going to use semi-autonomous work teams. So they wanted the Tavistock Institute to come and help with the semi-autonomous work teams. And it took us 5 years to sort that out. We did not, at the time, I was honoring what my US training had been, and I had taken advice from my UK colleagues. We involved trade union representatives, but we did not step into the trade union arena ourselves as OD consultants. About 3.5, 4 years into the project, they were doing extremely well. And one of the controversial issues from the trade union point of view is that the new younger guys in the new factory, they wanted to get paid more straight away because they were doing the work. Whereas the guys in the old factory, they did get some improvement, but they were still having to form their teams. And it was the machine hadn't been designed for semi-autonomous work teams. So they weren't speeding along quite as fast. And I walked in and I found out there's been a continual issue. And I came to visit them and see how they were doing. I always walk the territory. And I was told that the plant manager of the new plant had negotiated, the managing director had convinced him to give the new guys their raise. And there was, as you can imagine, conflict and argument and struggle going on. Now that's definitely trade union to trade union, manager to manager. I went into managing director and I said, do you know this is going on? He said, no, haven't a clue. And I said, look, would you allow me to host a meeting, management team at the top, representatives of the trade union and the teams and the OD change teams, all in a room together. And I sat on the line and I looked to the workers and I said, the management team doesn't know what's going on. I'm aware you're in disagreement about what's happening with the payment system. Could you talk to the managers so they know? And there were 45 minutes of hate, rage, outroar, outrage. They sat still. They didn't fight. Nobody hit anybody. But after 45 minutes, the managing director leaned forward and he said, okay, I think that we're going to stick with our existing plan, meaning that both factories will get the particular rise at the same time. Now you can imagine that the new factory people weren't very pleased with me, even though it wasn't my decision. So in that, I felt that they were going to ruin 3.5 years of really amazing work that they had been doing just with this one stupid slip. I felt like it was stupidity to me. And they did get there in the end. I hope that answers. It's an example. Now, I wouldn't have done that. It just so happened that I'd learned how to do management meetings with the group relations conference, and I thought I could handle it. And I did, just.
Thank you very much, Jean. So, Peter, are you going to put us into small groups for?
Well, I think Deej is going to be
He's going to do that.
able to do that. You'd like to move people into smaller conversations with the question that you'd identified, Jean?
Please, yes.
Okay. Yes. Deej, if you're ready and prepared to do that and can give us the question in chat so that folks are aware of what it is that Jean would like us to chat about, that would be great.
And you'll have about what? Maybe we should. Can we set it? Do we have it set?
How about? Well, you had suggested 15 minutes. That makes sense. Maybe about quarter to the hour, and then we'll come back and have about 15
absolutely a little bit early on the quarter of the hour, so we have. Yeah, great.
Okay. I didn't. Jason just sent me a message. What did he say? Oh, he put the question in chat. So, folks, if you'll check your chat, you'll see Jean's question. What challenges and opportunities in our OD&C practice might these Lewinian principles help us to address? So that's the question Jean's inviting you to chew on and talk together about for the next, almost 15 minutes. You're going to be separated into breakout rooms. Enjoy yourselves, and we'll bring you back.
So welcome back, everybody. Do we have any questions for Jean?
Okay, could we, questions, answers, comments?
Questions, answers, or comments?
Yeah, we've got time. We've got a generous amount of time. Yeah.
So in order to make this work, if you would kindly use the hand raise function, which I see Ted has already done. Thank you very much, Ted. So if you find yourself moved with a question for Jean. So Ted, would you like to start?
Yeah, two things before I forget them. Short-term memory is not so good. One, that in our conversation was Akakola and Uma and myself, was the observation that this was, Jean's focus was a systems focus. And we tend to have not be, some of us are very familiar with the TAVI work in small groups, which is contrasted with what we do with art history in the US, but less familiar with the long tradition of theorizing and work at the systems level, and really struck me about the power of it and how the nature of your clients, Jean, are big. These are big issues that you're working on. And the second was an observation that Uma made, which is this notion, which was the notion of focusing on the whole, focusing on the system, is plays itself out also in the way we do our small groups. Mm-hmm. So in the tradition in the US, that, and I'm very familiar with it because I lived through it, is that more characterized by the notion of, oh, you're on the hot seat now. So there's a series of people that get on the hot seat and get feedback, and which is a way of that characterizes, I think, a focus on the individual as opposed to the individual in the group at the moment, and the group's role in that, what that individual is doing. Otherwise, the group level intervention, which I think we're less capable of in the U.S. in our small group training, even.
May I say something?
I would hope so.
Hi, Ted.
That's the idea, Gene.
Hi, Ted. When you say that they're big, some of them were big, but I tried to match it with a smaller project in each case, because I think there is a kind of split that takes place in our field between the larger action research projects and the small to medium sized projects. And I think that when we're working with substantial change, it is always simultaneously individual and group and systemic if you're actually going to bring about a change. If you're just doing entertainment, which is how I experienced I used to do a great, team building, data feedback process. You could really do that and be incredibly entertained. And they could be entertained and it'd be really excellent done. But there's no, the follow on, the actual bringing about change to the organizational processes and the people in them, and leaving them in a position where they can do that. That's big work in that little letters, big. It is the whole point, in my view, is to be of use, not just to be entertaining.
Thanks. Matt, I think you're next.
Great. Thanks very much, Peter. Gene, hi. Good afternoon to you. Good to see you again. You're reminding me of a conversation we had some years ago about the different business models between the Tavistock Institute and NTL, and particularly as you're describing the long history of research and intervention that Tavistock has done. It's a capacity that we at NTL haven't had for 30 years, and I'm really struck with the difference. In our small group, we talked about the challenge of.
Rocky, can you shut that door?
In our group, we talked about the challenge of challenging organizations to deal with their environment, getting them past the preoccupation with their own internal occupations, their own internal challenges, and getting them to deal with the outside environment. And I'm just wondering, is that a factor in the work that you've been doing, and what ways have you been able to challenge organizations to see beyond themselves?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that if we hold on to the newer idea that NTL members and NTL is it's NTL members, I believe that there's probably some proportion of NTL members who are doing work that is simultaneously systems and action research. And what we seem to not do is talk about it very much. It'd be really nice to talk more about it. I don't market myself as somebody who's a specialist in environmental. You mean like climate change issues?
No. Sorry, I mean organizational environment. I mean getting the organization to look beyond itself and look at its sectoral environment, the competitive environment, the regulatory environment, economic environment.
Well, I think what I'm trying to get across with so many of these examples is that the client system, some bits of the client system are part of the division of labor, is to worry about the environment. Different parts of the environment, different functions worry about different parts of the environment. And almost always, if we're talking about a substantial change, then that substantial change is linked back into the environment somehow. So that's our job as consultants, to operate the Lewinian rules. And even if we're given, let's say we've been called in to help I'm thinking about a particular unit in a hospital where they've got huge problems with complaint procedures. And it just so happens that it's a mixture of people from 4 or 5 different countries. They're all Black women, 4 or 5 different countries, and then there's conflict. And we've been brought in to do team building and to connect somehow with the procedural process to fire people or keep people from being fired. This complicated thing. It looks like it's a group of like 8 people, but look, what's the unit? What unit? What's the medical unit that they're in? And what's going on with that medical unit? And how does that relate to what is happening with the funding of this particular bit of the medical unit? And what's happening with the staffing process, and where do these people come from? And to what extent are the differences amongst them? Can we talk about these differences? And what does it have to do with how they do the work? So to me, it's our job to ask these questions, or not necessarily directly to the client system, but we can collect the data during the diagnostic and dialogue processes. And then as a part of when we come back to offer, to feedback results and to talk about possible interventions, then we will have informed ourselves. And that part of our job is to encourage whoever we're trying to influence, who's brought us in, to think more broadly themselves, to not see it as a personnel problem or a race problem only or whatever.
So the reframing is our job.
I think it's our job to figure out we're the experts, or we're the ones who are trying to be experts in the situation. We can't expect our clients, if the client doesn't want to talk about it, don't want to talk about how the funding of that particular medical unit is tied to X, Y, or Z. If they don't want to talk about that, that doesn't mean we don't still think about it. We don't ask about it.
Got it. Very helpful, Jean. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Lennox, you're next in queue.
Yes, Jean, thank you very, very much. And I just want you to know it was wonderful to not only to hear you, but to hear that concise and both expansive and deep capture of Lubin's thinking. I was in a group with Helen Turnbull and Camelia from Brazil, and also Whitney. And I think one of the things we were talking about was what happens to us when we want to pay attention to those rules, but then we ourselves get captured in the dynamics of the system. When we begin to identify, coming back to what Edgar said yesterday, when we begin to kind of identify with different stakeholders, with different partisans of the system. And what I have found, and I think it comes back to the Tavistock approach and the NTL approach, is that I do believe, and I want your comment on this, that Tavistock identifies themselves more as social scientists, and NTL identifies themselves more as behavioral scientists. So in the Tavistock approach, they could stand aside and think of the rules in relation to the clients and the systems. And in the NTL approach, we want to kind of get in there, and in our perspective, part of dealing with the situation is like we get in a bit too closely to the client as we try to bring about, quote unquote, this behavioral change. And I wonder if that gets played out in our work, and whether that is something you see happening.
Yes, that the history of the phrase behavioral science is more American, yeah, and social science is more European. Yeah. That's true. And that, I think, partly has to do with the founding of behavioral psychology as control, behavioral control in America, and the resistance against that idea in the totally pure, never did anything wrong European side. I do think that if we find ourselves captured by different parts of the system, it never hurts. It always helps to say how sorry, my verb, I'm a little confused about which is the correct verb here. How are we caught up in a transference or a countertransference, and how does that relate to the organization? So it's data. If we have a concept of ourselves as social change people who come in and we are on the horse and we beat back the bad guys and help the good guys. If that's what we're doing, to me, that's not OD. There will times when you have to take sides or you want to take sides, but I think that our job is to help bring about organizational change in collaboration with our client systems and their complexities. That's what we're there to do. And yes, we will prefer some parts of the client system to other parts of the client system, but we need to be able, part of self as instrument, to use that NTL idea, is to put our preferences on the back burner and only bring them out at the point where, when you're cooking, you need to be able to say, what we're experiencing and how that might relate to what they're experiencing. So countertransference, transference and countertransference, I think is really important, and it becomes data then. So the discipline, and this is true, and there's nothing in NTL group work that doesn't allow this thing that somehow shows up in Tavistock Institute oriented stuff that shows the same thing, which is that you're experiencing something, that's one bit of data. Now this is more triangulation of data. This is qualitative research, which is, practical qualitative research from an American angle. That is, I sell this the other way around to the Europeans, right? I'm having an experience. That's one experience. I'm observing. What am I observing in the client system? I'm observing X, Y, or Z in the client system. And here's another bit. So I got 3 bits of data. And this, I think this means, and this is going on because. So we use what we know about good qualitative data analysis to feedback. And one of the bits of data is, I'm really hating the engineering people over there who want to just screw the older guys and make them not get the pay rise. Yeah, okay, I didn't think that was right, personally, right? But that's not the whole point. The whole point is, now what else is going on? What am I observing? How does that relate to this point in the change process? And to me, that's use of self, but it's also, yes, okay, it's got a scientific, it's qualitative science, though. It's practical science that really blends itself beautifully with both, in my opinion, with the Tavistock Institute and NTL.
Yes.
Great. Thank you,
Thank you.
Jean.
Thank you.
I want to be both, as much as possible, graceful and respectful of the fact that obviously Jean was here, and we have 2 more presenters this morning before we leave for lunch. And obviously, this is a great opportunity. If you've been moved and stimulated by Jean's presentation, this is an opportunity for you to be in touch with her and to have a personal dialogue with her about what you've heard and what questions remain.